Elena Whitmore's hands trembled as she pushed open the door to the private study, expecting to find her fiancé reading letters by the fire. Instead, she found him standing far too close to her own sister, their voices hushed, their faces caught in a moment that no explanation could undo. The candle in her hand nearly slipped from her fingers. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Elena turned and walked away without a single word. She did not scream, she did not cry out. She simply closed the door behind her, as if she had walked into the wrong room by mistake, and she kept walking until she reached the garden, where the cold night air hit her like a slap that finally woke her from a dream she had been living in for 2 years. Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ashcombe, called her name from the window above, but Elena did not look back. She had spent her whole life being taught to smile through pain, to curtsy through humiliation, to say the right thing at the right time, so that no one would ever see how deeply she felt things. But this time, there was no smile left to give. There was only the sound of her own footsteps on the gravel path, steady and quick, carrying her away from the life she had built her entire future around. Cassandra Whitmore was not just her sister. She was her younger sister, the one Elena had protected since childhood, the one she had given up her own comforts for more times than she could count. When their mother passed, it was Elena who had raised Cassandra in every way that mattered, who had sat by her bed during fevers, who had saved her portion of sweets and given them away without complaint. And this was the sister who now stood in that study with Adrian, in a closeness that spoke louder than any words could. Elena reached the edge of the estate before she allowed herself to stop. She pressed a hand to the cold stone wall and let her breathing settle, forcing herself to think clearly, instead of falling into the panic clawing at her chest. She thought of the wedding gown hanging in her room, half finished, the silk still waiting for its final stitches. She thought of the guest list already sent to 50 families across the county. She thought of her father's pride, the alliance this marriage was meant to secure, the years of careful planning that had led to this exact night. None of it mattered anymore. Not the gown, not the guest list, not her father's ambitions. What mattered was the truth she had just seen with her own eyes, a truth that no apology could erase and no explanation could soften. She did not return to her room that night. Instead, she found the estate's stable master, an old and loyal man named Walter, who had known her since she was a child, riding her first pony. She asked him for a horse and a small amount of coin, and though his eyes were full of questions, he did not ask a single one. He simply saddled the gentlest mare in the stable and pressed a worn leather pouch into her hands, whispering that she should be careful on the roads at night. Elena rode until the estate's lights faded behind her, until the only sound left was the rhythm of hooves against the packed earth and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She did not have a plan. She only had the certainty that she could not stay, that every hour spent under that roof would be another hour of pretending, and she was done pretending. By dawn, she had reached the town of Millbrook, a place she had visited only once before with her late mother, years ago, when the world still felt simple and safe. She sold a small ring, not the engagement ring, which she had left behind on her dressing table, but a modest piece of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, one she could bear to part with, because she told herself her mother would have understood. The coin from the ring, combined with what Walter had given her, was enough to secure a room above a bakery and buy herself a few weeks of quiet. The woman who owned the bakery, a kind widow named Margaret Hollis, did not ask many questions either. She looked at Elena's fine but travel-worn dress, at the exhaustion carved into her young face, and she simply offered her a warm loaf of bread and a place to sit. Something in Margaret's eyes told Elena that this woman had seen her own share of heartbreak, and that she recognized it now in a stranger's face. Word of Elena's disappearance reached the Blackwood estate by midday. Adrian searched every room, questioned every servant, and rode out himself along the main roads leading from the estate, but he found no trace of her. Her father raged about the scandal such an act would bring, more concerned with the family's reputation than with his daughter's well-being. And this too became one more reason Elena knew she had made the right choice in leaving. Cassandra, for her part, wept dramatically in front of the household staff, insisting that Elena had misunderstood an innocent moment, that nothing improper had occurred, that her sister had always been prone to jealousy and dramatic assumptions. But the staff who had seen the closeness between the Duke and Cassandra over the previous weeks exchanged knowing glances that they were careful never to share with their employers. Adrian himself could not explain, even to his own conscience, exactly what had happened in that study. He knew only that Cassandra had come to him with a letter, claiming it concerned Elena's well-being, and that somehow the conversation had drifted into a closeness he had not intended and could not fully account for. He knew how it must have looked. He knew that explanations offered after the fact would sound hollow and convenient, and he knew that Elena, whom he had loved since they were children playing in these very gardens, was now gone, and he did not know where to find her. Weeks passed. Adrian sent men to search the surrounding towns, but Elena had chosen her path carefully, taking back roads and avoiding any place where a duke's men might think to look for a runaway bride. She changed her name to Ellen Hart, a small alteration that felt significant enough to mark the beginning of a new life, while still holding on to a thread of who she had been. In Millbrook, Ellen began working in Margaret's bakery, learning the trade with a diligence that surprised even herself. She had never worked with her hands before, had never needed to, but she found an unexpected comfort in the rhythm of kneading dough, in the warmth of the ovens, in the simple satisfaction of a well-risen loaf. It was honest work, work that asked nothing of her except effort, and after a lifetime of navigating the complicated expectations of noble society, this simplicity felt like a gift. She wrote one letter before cutting off all contact with her old life. It was addressed to her father, brief and controlled, informing him that she was safe, and asking him not to search for her. She did not mention Adrian. She did not mention Cassandra. She simply stated that she needed time and space to decide her own future, and she asked for his understanding, though she suspected she would not receive it. Her father's response, when it eventually reached her through a network of trusted intermediaries, was cold and full of disappointment, more concerned with the damage to the family name than with any genuine worry for her safety. Reading his words, Elena felt something inside her settle into place. She had made the right choice. Whatever loneliness lay ahead of her, it was better than a lifetime spent among people who valued appearances over honesty. As the weeks turned into a month, Elena began to notice changes in her own body that she could not ignore. The exhaustion that went beyond her long hours at the bakery, the sudden aversion to smells she had once enjoyed, the persistent tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. She sat alone in her small room above the bakery one evening, staring at her own reflection in a cracked mirror, and she understood with a clarity that both terrified and steadied her that she was carrying a child. Adrian's child. The realization brought a fresh wave of complicated emotions. Anger, because this child would forever tie her to a man who had broken her trust. Fear, because she was alone in an unfamiliar town, with no family support, and no means beyond what she earned baking bread. And beneath all of that, something she had not expected to feel, a quiet, fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. She placed a hand over her stomach and made a silent promise. Whatever had happened between her and Adrian, whatever betrayal had driven her from her old life, this child was innocent of it all. This child deserved a mother who would fight for a good life, regardless of the circumstances of its beginning. Elena resolved in that moment that she would raise this baby herself, with honesty and love, far away from the schemes and secrets of noble houses. She told Margaret the truth a few days later, unable to carry the secret alone any longer. She expected judgment, perhaps even dismissal from her position at the bakery. Instead, Margaret simply pulled her into a warm embrace and told her that life had a way of testing people before rewarding them, and that Elena's strength in leaving a bad situation showed exactly the kind of mother she would become. With Margaret's support, Elena began preparing for a future she had never imagined for herself. She saved every coin she could. She learned every aspect of the bakery business, until Margaret trusted her to manage it during her own absences, and she found a small measure of peace in the routine of her new life. The pain of that night in the study never fully disappeared, but it softened into something she could carry without it breaking her. Meanwhile, back at the Blackwood estate, Adrian's search efforts eventually slowed, not from lack of care, but from lack of any remaining leads. Elena had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, and though Adrian could not forget her, he was forced by circumstance and family pressure to turn his attention to matters of the estate that could not wait indefinitely. Cassandra, sensing an opportunity in her sister's absence, positioned herself carefully within Adrian's life. offering comfort and companionship during his darkest weeks of searching and worry. Adrian, exhausted and grieving the loss of the woman he had truly loved, allowed himself to be guided by his family's insistence that a marriage between himself and Cassandra would preserve the alliance both families had originally sought, and would quiet the scandal that Elena's disappearance had caused throughout the county. It was not a decision made from love. It was a decision made from exhaustion, obligation, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from losing someone you cannot stop thinking about. Adrian agreed to the arrangement with a heavy heart, telling himself that Elena had made her choice by leaving, and that he owed his family and his title some measure of stability after the chaos her disappearance had caused. He did not know, as he stood before the altar months later, with Cassandra beside him, that miles away, in a small town called Millbrook, the woman he had truly loved was carrying his child, building a new life, brick by brick, with nothing but her own determination and the kindness of a stranger who had become like family to her. As the church bells rang out over the Blackwood estate announcing a marriage built on convenience rather than love, Elena stood in the small kitchen above Margaret's bakery, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. She had no way of knowing what was happening at that exact moment, no way of knowing that the path she had chosen and the path Adrian had been forced onto were now diverging permanently, at least for the time being. She only knew that tomorrow she would wake up, open the bakery, knead the dough, and continue building a life for herself and for the child growing inside her. Whatever the future held, whatever complications or challenges awaited, Elena Whitmore, now known simply as Ellen Hart, was determined to face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her out of that study and away from a life built on pretense. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, Elena felt something close to hope settling in her chest. She was no longer the girl who had been betrayed. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who would soon be a mother, fighting fiercely for her child's future. Regardless of what noble titles or family names might one day come calling, Ellen pressed a hand to the small of her back as she carried a tray of fresh loaves from the oven, feeling the ache that had become her constant companion in these final months of waiting. Margaret watched her with concerned eyes, insisting she sit down before she dropped the entire tray, but Ellen simply laughed softly and shook her head, continuing her work despite the growing weight she carried. The bakery had become more than just a place of employment. It had become her sanctuary, her proof that a life built on honesty and hard work could sustain a person, even when everything else had been stripped away. The townspeople of Millbrook had grown fond of the quiet young woman who arrived each morning before dawn, who greeted every customer with genuine warmth, and who never once complained, despite the obvious signs that she carried her burdens alone. No one in Millbrook knew her true story. They knew only that Ellen Hart was a widow, a lie Margaret had suggested to protect her from the judgment that unmarried mothers often faced in smaller towns. Ellen had resisted the deception at first, uncomfortable with building her new life on a foundation of falsehood, but Margaret had gently reminded her that some lies existed simply to protect, not to harm, and that her child deserved to grow up without the weight of scandal attached to their name. The birth came on a stormy evening in early spring, thunder rolling across the sky, as Margaret and the town's midwife worked together to bring Ellen's son into the world. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Ellen feared she would not survive it, moments when the pain overwhelmed every rational thought and left her clinging only to the image of the child she was fighting to bring safely into existence. When the baby finally arrived, his cry cutting through the storm outside, Ellen felt every ounce of exhaustion melt away as she held him for the first time. He had a full head of dark hair, and even in those first moments, she could see traces of Adrian in the shape of his eyes, in the particular curve of his small mouth. She named him Theodore, though she immediately began calling him Theo, a name that felt warm and simple and entirely his own, separate from any noble lineage or complicated history. The days following Theo's birth were a blur of exhaustion and overwhelming love. Margaret took over much of the bakery's operations, insisting that Ellen focus entirely on recovering and caring for her newborn son. The townspeople brought gifts, small offerings of blankets and clothing, and homemade remedies for a fussy baby, treating Ellen with a warmth that felt entirely different from the calculated politeness she had known in noble circles. As Theo grew from a newborn into an infant and then a toddler, Ellen found herself falling into a rhythm of motherhood that felt both exhausting and deeply fulfilling. She woke before dawn to begin her bakery work, spent her mornings kneading dough with Theo napping nearby in a basket lined with soft blankets, and spent her afternoons watching him take his first wobbling steps across the wooden floor of their small apartment above the shop. There were difficult days too, days when the weight of raising a child alone pressed down on her with particular heaviness, when she watched other families in town, mothers and fathers together, and felt the sharp absence of a partner to share both the joys and burdens of parenthood. On those days, she allowed herself brief moments of grief, quiet tears shed alone in her room after Theo had fallen asleep, before she gathered herself and continued forward, unwilling to let sorrow define the life she was building. Margaret became something of a grandmother figure to Theo, delighting in his laughter, teaching him simple words alongside his growing vocabulary, and providing the kind of steady presence that Ellen herself had lost when her own mother passed years ago. The bakery, once simply a place of work, transformed into a genuine home, filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of a small boy's delighted giggles. By the time Theo turned 3, he had developed a personality entirely his own, curious and bright, asking endless questions about everything around him, from why bread rose in the oven to why the stars appeared only at night. Ellen found herself constantly amazed by his intelligence, by the way he absorbed information, and asked increasingly complex questions, traits that reminded her uncomfortably of Adrian's own sharp mind, though she pushed such thoughts away whenever they surfaced. She had made peace, mostly, with never telling Theo about his father. She told herself it was for the best, that a child raised without expectations of noble titles or complicated family politics would grow up simpler and happier than one caught in the middle of such affairs. But there were quiet moments, late at night, when she wondered if she was making the right choice, if Theo deserved to know where he came from, even if that knowledge might complicate the peaceful life she had built for them both. The town of Millbrook itself began to feel less like a temporary refuge, and more like a genuine home. Ellen had made friends among the other shopkeepers, had developed a particular fondness for the elderly gentleman who ran the bookshop next door, and always saved interesting stories for Theo to look at, and had even begun to feel a sense of belonging she had never quite experienced within the rigid structure of noble society. Financial security remained a constant concern, however. Margaret's bakery provided steady income, but raising a child alone left little room for savings or unexpected expenses. When Theo fell ill with a fever during his second winter, Ellen spent sleepless nights nursing him back to health, while quietly calculating how she would afford the medicine the local healer recommended, grateful when Margaret insisted on covering the cost without being asked. It was during this period that Margaret began teaching Ellen not just how to bake, but how to manage the business itself, the accounting, the ordering of supplies, the negotiations with local farmers for flour and butter. Margaret was growing older, her hands beginning to show the effects of decades of hard work, and though neither woman spoke directly about it, both understood that Margaret was preparing Ellen to eventually take over the bakery entirely. This unspoken arrangement gave Ellen a sense of purpose beyond simply surviving day to day. She began to see a genuine future taking shape before her, one where she would own and operate a successful business, where Theo would grow up with financial stability and a strong sense of community, where the pain of her past would fade into simply being one chapter of a much longer and ultimately happier story. Word occasionally reached Millbrook of happenings in the wider world, carried by traveling merchants and the occasional newspaper that made its way to the town's small reading room. Ellen avoided these sources of news deliberately, unwilling to expose herself to any information about the Blackwood estate, or the marriage she knew must have taken place between Adrian and Cassandra. She had built walls around that part of her past, and she intended to keep those walls firmly in place. But avoiding news entirely proved impossible when a traveling merchant, unaware of any personal connection, mentioned casually to Margaret that the Duke of Ashcomb's marriage had proven a troubled one, with rumors of a cold and loveless household circulating throughout the county. Margaret relayed this information to Ellen carefully, watching her reaction, uncertain whether it would bring pain or perhaps some small measure of validation. Ellen felt neither triumph nor sorrow at this news, only a distant sense of having moved beyond caring about the details of a life she had left behind. Whatever difficulties Adrian faced in his marriage were no longer her concern. She had Theo, she had the bakery, She had Margaret's steady friendship, and she had built something real and lasting from the wreckage of her broken engagement. As Theo approached his 4th birthday, Ellen began noticing changes in the town's rhythm that suggested increasing prosperity and growth. New families were arriving, drawn by Millbrook's reputation for honest trade and welcoming community. The bakery's business increased accordingly, and Ellen found herself working longer hours to meet the growing demand, though she never allowed the work to interfere with the time she dedicated to Theo each evening. She began teaching him herself in the quiet hours after the bakery closed, using books borrowed from the bookshop next door to introduce him to letters and numbers far earlier than most children in town received such instruction. Theo absorbed these lessons eagerly, his natural curiosity making him an enthusiastic student, and Ellen felt a particular pride watching him grow into a bright and capable young boy. The years had changed her too, in ways she had not fully anticipated when she first arrived in Millbrook as a heartbroken young woman, with nothing but a small bag and a horse, borrowed from a loyal stablemaster. She had grown stronger, more confident, more capable of handling whatever challenges life presented. The naive girl who had once believed unquestioningly in fairy tale endings had become a resourceful woman who understood that true security came from one's own efforts, not from promises made by others. Yet despite this growth, despite the genuine contentment she had found in her new life, there remained a small part of Ellen that still carried the wound of that night in the study, still wondered occasionally what might have been if circumstances had been different, if trust had not been broken so completely and so publicly. She did not dwell on these thoughts often, but they surfaced, sometimes, in quiet moments, reminding her that healing, even years later, was not always complete. Margaret, ever perceptive, noticed these occasional shadows crossing Ellen's expression and would gently draw her into conversation, reminding her of how far she had come, how much she had built, how proud she should be of the life she had created for herself and her son. These conversations always helped, grounding Ellen back in the present, in the reality of her successful bakery and her thriving child, rather than allowing her to linger too long in memories of a painful past. As spring arrived once more, bringing warmer weather and the promise of new beginnings that seemed to accompany the season each year, Ellen found herself standing in the bakery doorway one morning, watching Theo chase butterflies in the small garden Margaret had cultivated behind the shop. His laughter rang out clear and joyful in the morning air, and Ellen felt a wave of gratitude wash over her for everything she had, despite everything she had lost. She had no way of knowing that this peaceful chapter of her life was about to be interrupted, that the careful walls she had built around her past were about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. For now, she simply enjoyed the moment, the sunshine, her son's laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of a life built entirely on her own terms, far from the complicated politics and betrayals of the world she had left behind. The bakery bell chimed as a customer entered, and Ellen turned to greet them with the same warm smile she offered every visitor, unaware that this particular spring would bring changes that would test everything she had built and force her to confront a past she had worked so hard to leave behind. 5 years had passed since Ellen first arrived in Millbrook, and the town had become as much a part of her identity as her own name. Theo, now a lively 5-year-old with an ever-expanding vocabulary and an insatiable curiosity about the world, had become the center of not just Ellen's life, but the affection of the entire community that had watched him grow from infancy. The bakery, now officially under Ellen's management after Margaret's health had begun to decline enough that she preferred a quieter role, had expanded to include a small seating area where customers could enjoy fresh pastries with tea. This addition had been Ellen's idea, a way to increase revenue while creating a warmer, more welcoming space for the community to gather. The gamble had paid off handsomely, and the bakery now stood as one of the most popular establishments in Millbrook. Ellen had grown into her role as both mother and business owner, with a confidence that surprised even herself when she reflected on the frightened young woman who had arrived in town years earlier. She managed accounts, negotiated with suppliers, trained the 2 young assistants she had hired to help with the increased workload, and still found time each evening to sit with Theo, reviewing his lessons and listening to the endless stream of observations and questions that poured from his active mind. Theo had inherited more than just his father's physical features, though those were becoming increasingly apparent as he grew, particularly in the sharp intelligence behind his eyes and a certain natural confidence in the way he carried himself, even at such a young age. He possessed an easy charm that drew people to him, an ability to make friends effortlessly among both children and adults, and a stubborn determination that occasionally led to conflicts with Ellen when he decided he knew better than the rules she set for him. Despite these occasional battles of will, common to any spirited child his age, Theo was fundamentally kind-hearted, sharing his treats with other children without hesitation, showing concern when he noticed someone was sad, and displaying a natural sense of fairness that Ellen took great pride in having nurtured. She often wondered if these qualities came from her own upbringing or if they were simply innate to his character, but regardless of their origin, she cherished them deeply. The bookshop owner next door, an elderly man named Edmund who had become something of a grandfather figure to Theo, often remarked that the boy possessed a mind far too sharp for his age, constantly asking questions that challenged even Edmund's considerable knowledge. Theo had already begun reading simple books on his own, a skill Ellen had nurtured through countless evenings of patient instruction, and his appetite for stories seemed endless. Life in Millbrook had settled into a comfortable rhythm that Ellen treasured, though she remained ever vigilant about protecting the peaceful existence she had built. She rarely thought about her old life anymore, the noble titles and complicated family politics, feeling like memories from someone else's story rather than her own past. When occasional news from the wider world reached the town, she listened with the detached interest of a stranger rather than someone who had once been intimately connected to such affairs. This deliberate distance from her past had become easier to maintain as the years passed, though Ellen sometimes wondered if she was doing Theo a disservice by keeping him entirely ignorant of his heritage. She had decided, for now, that the risks of revealing such information outweighed any potential benefits. Theo was happy, secure, and thriving in his simple life, and she saw no reason to complicate that with truths that might only confuse or burden him. The community of Millbrook had embraced Ellen and her son so completely that she sometimes forgot she had ever been an outsider. She had close friendships with several of the other shopkeepers, particularly with a seamstress named Rosalind who had become her closest confidant, someone she could share both the joys and frustrations of single motherhood with, though even Rosalind knew only the fabricated story of Ellen's widowhood, not the true circumstances of Theo's origin. Rosalind's own daughter, a girl named Beatrice who was close to Theo's age, had become his frequent playmate, and the two children spent countless afternoons together in the garden behind the bakery, their laughter and games providing a constant soundtrack to Ellen's working hours. Watching Theo's easy friendship with Beatrice, Ellen felt reassured that she had made the right choices in raising him within this warm, supportive community. As Theo's 5th birthday approached, Ellen began planning a small celebration, nothing extravagant, simply a gathering of his young friends and their families in the bakery's garden, with treats she would prepare herself, and games organized by Rosalind, who had a particular talent for entertaining children. These small celebrations had become important markers in Ellen's life, moments where she could step back and appreciate how far she and Theo had come from those uncertain early days. The morning of Theo's birthday dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for the outdoor celebration Ellen had planned. She woke before dawn as usual, but instead of her regular baking duties, she focused entirely on preparing special treats for the party. Small iced cakes shaped like animals that she knew would delight the children, and a larger cake for Theo himself, decorated with his favorite colors. Theo woke with the particular excitement only a birthday could bring, rushing into the kitchen still in his nightclothes to see what preparations were underway. Ellen laughed at his enthusiasm, gently steering him back toward getting dressed, while promising he would see everything once his friends arrived. His impatience was endearing, a reminder of the pure, uncomplicated joy children could find in simple celebrations. By mid-morning, the garden behind the bakery had filled with children and their parents, the sound of laughter and chatter creating a festive atmosphere that brought a genuine smile to Ellen's face. She moved through the gathering, ensuring everyone had refreshments, chatting with the other mothers, and periodically checking on Theo, who was thoroughly enjoying being the center of attention among his friends. It was during this celebration, as Ellen stood near the garden gate, refilling a pitcher of lemonade, that she noticed a finely dressed stranger pause on the street outside, seemingly caught by the sound of children's laughter drifting from the garden. Something about his posture, the careful way he carried himself, struck her as vaguely familiar, though she could not immediately place why, and she quickly returned her attention to her hosting duties, dismissing the momentary unease as simply the natural caution of a protective mother. The party continued through the afternoon, filled with games, treats, and the particular chaos that came with gathering a dozen energetic children in one location. Theo received simple but treasured gifts from his friends: a wooden toy horse from Beatrice, a set of colored pencils from another playmate, and he beamed with pride as he showed each gift to Ellen, insisting she admire every detail. As the celebration wound down and parents began collecting their tired but happy children, Ellen found herself reflecting on the life she had built, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for everything she had accomplished, despite the painful beginning that had brought her to Millbrook. Theo, exhausted from the day's excitement, fell asleep earlier than usual that evening, and Ellen sat beside his bed for a long while, simply watching him sleep, feeling her heart swell with love for this remarkable child she had raised largely on her own. The following weeks continued in their usual pleasant rhythm, the bakery bustling with regular customers, Theo continuing his lessons and play with characteristic enthusiasm, and Ellen finding continued satisfaction in the stable, secure life she had constructed. She had no reason to suspect that anything was about to change, no warning that the careful walls she had built around her past were about to face their greatest test. It began with small things, easy to dismiss individually, but which, in retrospect, formed a pattern Ellen would later recognize. A stranger asking questions at the local inn about a woman matching her description who might have settled in the area with a young child. A traveling merchant mentioning that a well-dressed gentleman had been asking similar questions in neighboring towns. Rosalind casually mentioning that someone had inquired at her shop about the bakery owner's background. Ellen dismissed these reports initially, telling herself they were likely nothing more than coincidence, perhaps someone searching for an entirely different woman who happened to share similar circumstances. She had been careful, so very careful, to leave no trail that could lead back to her old life. Surely after 5 years, any search for her would have long since been abandoned. But as autumn approached and the questions continued, growing more specific and more frequent, according to the reports reaching her through the town's efficient gossip network, Ellen began to feel the first genuine stirrings of alarm. She started watching the street outside the bakery more carefully, noting strangers who lingered too long, feeling an instinctive wariness she had not experienced since her earliest days in Millbrook. She confided her growing concern to Margaret one evening, sharing details of the questions being asked, and the unsettling feeling that someone was closing in on the carefully constructed life she had built. Margaret listened with grave attention, her weathered face creasing with worry as she considered the implications of what Ellen was describing. Could this be connected to her past? Margaret asked gently. To the life she had fled from years earlier. Ellen did not want to believe it, wanted desperately to convince herself that this was simply an unfortunate coincidence, but a deep instinct told her otherwise, told her that the peaceful existence she had built for herself and Theo might be approaching its end, one way or another. That night, after Theo had fallen asleep, Ellen sat alone in the small kitchen above the bakery, staring out the window at the darkened street below, wondering if she should consider moving again, starting over somewhere new where no one would think to search. But the thought of uprooting Theo from everything he knew, from his friends and his comfortable routine, filled her with a reluctance that made her hesitate to act immediately on her fears. She decided to wait, to watch and gather more information before making any drastic decisions. Perhaps the questions would stop, perhaps whoever was asking would move on to search elsewhere, and the peaceful life she had built would remain undisturbed. But even as she made this decision, a part of her recognized the fragility of such hope, understood that some pasts, no matter how carefully buried, had a way of eventually surfacing, whether one was prepared for their return or not. Adrian Blackwood stood at the window of his study, the very same room where his life had unraveled 5 years earlier, watching rain streak down the glass while papers requiring his signature sat untouched on the desk behind him. The marriage to Cassandra had proven exactly as loveless as he had feared it might, a partnership built on obligation rather than affection, and the years had done nothing to soften the coldness that existed between them. Cassandra had grown increasingly distant over the years, spending more time at social gatherings in the city than at the estate, and Adrian had long since stopped questioning her extended absences. Their marriage functioned more as a business arrangement than any genuine partnership, each fulfilling the minimal social obligations required, while living largely separate lives within the same grand house. The estate itself continued to prosper under Adrian's careful management, but he found little joy in his success, going through the motions of his duties as Duke with a hollow efficiency that concerned those closest to him. His mother, still living in the estate's east wing, often expressed worry about her son's diminished spirit, though Adrian always deflected her concerns with polite reassurances that satisfied no one, least of all himself. He had never stopped thinking about Elena, in the quiet moments between his duties, in the sleepless nights that had become increasingly common. Her face returned to him with painful clarity, the memory of her expression in that final moment, before she turned and walked away from him forever. He had searched extensively in those first months after her disappearance, exhausting every resource available to him, but Elena had vanished so completely that even his most skilled investigators had eventually admitted defeat. Over time, the search had officially ended, though Adrian had never truly stopped hoping for some sign of her, some indication that she was safe and well, wherever she had chosen to build her new life. He told himself this hope was simply concern for someone he had once cared deeply for, nothing more, though the persistent ache in his chest, whenever he thought of her, suggested his feelings ran considerably deeper than mere concern. The truth of that fateful night had haunted him for years, the knowledge that Cassandra's manipulation had cost him the woman he truly loved, forcing him into a marriage that brought neither happiness nor genuine partnership. He had confronted Cassandra about her role in that evening's events shortly after their wedding, when the full weight of his loss had settled upon him, but she had denied any deliberate scheming, insisting that Elena had simply misunderstood an innocent situation and overreacted dramatically. Adrian had never fully believed her explanation, sensing something calculated in Cassandra's behavior that evening, though he lacked concrete proof of any deliberate manipulation. This uncertainty had eaten at him for years, the not knowing whether he had lost Elena to genuine circumstance or to deliberate betrayal, whether there had been any way to prevent the loss that had defined the trajectory of his adult life. His relationship with Cassandra had deteriorated further as the years passed, marked by increasingly frequent arguments and long periods of icy silence. She had grown resentful of what she perceived as Adrian's continued attachment to Elena's memory, accusing him on more than one occasion of never truly committing himself to their marriage, of always holding some part of himself back for a woman who had abandoned him years earlier. These accusations, though delivered with considerable venom, contained enough truth that Adrian found himself unable to fully deny them. He had never loved Cassandra, had entered their marriage from obligation and exhaustion rather than genuine affection, and this fundamental absence of love had poisoned whatever chance their union might have had for happiness, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Adrian's business dealings had expanded considerably over the years, requiring frequent travel throughout the county, and occasionally beyond. Journeys he had come to appreciate as welcome escapes from the tension that permeated his home life. It was during one such business trip, prompted by a promising investment opportunity in the textile trade, that Adrian found himself traveling toward a coastal region he had never before visited, a series of small towns known for their honest trade and welcoming communities. His business associate, a merchant named Gerald Whitfield, had recommended several towns worth exploring for potential trade partnerships, mentioning Millbrook specifically as a location experiencing notable growth and prosperity in recent years. Adrian had agreed to include the town in his travel itinerary, thinking little of the decision beyond its practical business implications. The journey itself proved longer than anticipated, delayed by poor road conditions following weeks of heavy rain, and Adrian arrived in the region feeling the particular exhaustion that came from extended travel, combined with the persistent weight of thoughts he could never quite escape, regardless of distance traveled or business matters requiring his attention. As his carriage approached Millbrook, rain began falling once again, a sudden downpour that forced his driver to seek immediate shelter rather than continuing toward the inn where accommodations had been arranged. The carriage pulled alongside the nearest available shelter, which happened to be a small bakery, with warm light glowing invitingly through its windows, despite the gray, storm-darkened afternoon outside. Adrian stepped from the carriage, pulling his coat tighter against the sudden chill of the rain, and made his way quickly toward the bakery's entrance, seeking nothing more than temporary shelter from the storm, while his driver attended to the horses. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and he found himself in a warm, welcoming space, filled with the comforting scent of fresh bread, and something sweet baking in the ovens beyond the counter. He paused just inside the doorway, shaking rain from his coat, and taking in his surroundings. A modest but clearly well-maintained establishment, with a small seating area, where a few customers enjoyed tea and pastries, despite the weather outside. His attention was drawn toward the counter, where a woman stood with her back to him, arranging fresh loaves on display. Her posture, and the particular way she moved, striking him with an inexplicable sense of familiarity that he could not immediately place. Something about her caused him to pause, his heart beginning to race with an anticipation he did not fully understand, and as if sensing his presence, the woman turned to greet her newest customer with the professional warmth she extended to everyone who entered her establishment. The moment their eyes met, Adrian felt the entire world narrow to this single point, this single impossible moment, as recognition crashed through him with overwhelming force. Elena. She stood before him, older now, her features matured into a beauty that had deepened rather than faded with the passing years, but unmistakably, undeniably, Elena. The woman he had loved and lost, the woman he had searched for so desperately, and had eventually been forced to accept as gone forever. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither spoke, simply staring across the small distance between them, as 5 years of separation collapsed into this single, suspended moment of shock and recognition. Elena felt the color drain from her face, as she registered exactly who stood before her. Dripping rain onto her bakery's floor, staring at her with an expression that mixed disbelief with something far more complicated. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to flee, to disappear into the back room and pretend this moment was not happening, but her feet remained rooted to the spot, her mind racing through the implications of this impossible reunion. "Adrian," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper, though even this simple acknowledgement felt like it cost her enormous effort to produce. He took a step further into the bakery, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he feared that looking away, even briefly, might cause her to vanish once again, as she had done 5 years earlier. "I have been searching for you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "For years, Elena, I searched everywhere." She felt panic rising in her chest, thoughts immediately turning to Theo, who was currently upstairs with Margaret, blissfully unaware that his father had just walked into their lives after 5 years of complete absence. She needed to think, needed to find some way to manage this situation before it spiraled beyond her control, but Adrian's presence, so unexpected and so overwhelming, made clear thinking nearly impossible. "Why are you here?" she asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she recognized the obvious answer, that this meeting was pure coincidence, that Adrian had simply sought shelter from the storm, without any knowledge that fate would deliver him directly to her doorstep after 5 years of separation. "Business," he answered simply, gesturing vaguely toward the door where his carriage remained parked in the rain. "I had no idea," he continued, his voice softening. "I had no idea you were here, Elena. I thought I would never find you." The bell above the door chimed again, and Elena's attention was drawn toward the sound with dawning horror as she watched her son enter from the back room, Margaret following close behind him, both apparently drawn by the sound of the storm intensifying outside. Theo's eyes, so unmistakably similar to his father's, swept across the bakery's interior before settling curiously on the well-dressed stranger standing near the entrance. Adrian's gaze followed Elena's, and Elena watched with a sense of inevitable dread as his expression shifted from confusion to dawning recognition, his eyes moving between the young boy's face and features he clearly recognized as disturbingly similar to his own. The silence that followed felt to Elena like it stretched for an eternity, though in reality, only seconds passed before Adrian spoke again, his voice barely steady. "Elena," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving Theo's face. "Is that our son?" The question hung in the air between them, and Elena felt every possible response competing for dominance in her racing mind. She could deny it, could invent some explanation for Theo's resemblance to a man he had never met, could protect the careful fiction of widowhood she had maintained for 5 years. But looking at Adrian's face, at the raw hope and fear mingled in his expression, she found she could not bring herself to lie, not about something this fundamental. Theo, sensing the tension in the room despite not understanding its cause, moved closer to Elena's side, his small hand finding hers instinctively. She squeezed his fingers gently, drawing strength from his presence, even as she prepared to answer the question that would change everything about the careful life she had built. Margaret stepped forward, her expression grave, positioning herself slightly between Adrian and the child, as if to offer protection, though she said nothing, allowing Elena to navigate this moment as she saw fit. The other customers in the bakery had grown quiet, sensing the significance of the unfolding scene without fully understanding its context, and Elena became acutely aware of the audience witnessing this deeply personal confrontation. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt internally. "Margaret, could you take Theo upstairs?" Theo protested immediately, his natural curiosity refusing to accept being excluded from whatever important conversation was clearly taking place. But Margaret, understanding the necessity of the moment, gently guided him toward the back stairs despite his complaints, promising him a special treat if he cooperated without further argument. Elena watched her son disappear up the stairs with a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that whatever happened next would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both their lives. Once the remaining customers had also been ushered out, with Margaret's assistant closing the shop for the remainder of the afternoon despite the obvious loss in business this would create, Elena found herself alone with Adrian for the first time in 5 years. The rain continued falling steadily outside, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that seemed to underscore the weight of the moment. "Answer my question," Adrian said, his voice quiet but insistent, all pretense of casual business conversation abandoned entirely. "Is that boy my son?" Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself before responding. "His name is Theo," she said, "and yes, he is your son." The words seemed to hit Adrian with physical force, and he sank slowly into one of the small chairs near the window, his hands coming up to cover his face briefly, before he looked back at Elena, with an expression that mixed wonder, grief, and something that looked almost like anger, though Elena suspected the anger was directed inward rather than toward her. "5 years," he said finally. "You kept my son from me for 5 years, Elena. Why? Why would you do such a thing?" The question ignited something within Elena that had remained carefully controlled for years, and she felt old anger surfacing with unexpected intensity. "Why would I do such a thing?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Adrian, I found you in that study with my own sister. I saw with my own eyes what I saw. What was I supposed to do? Stay and pretend I hadn't witnessed such a betrayal?" Adrian stood quickly, moving toward her with an urgency that made her step back instinctively. "That was not what it appeared to be," he said, his voice pleading now. "Elena, I have spent 5 years trying to understand what happened that night myself. Cassandra came to me claiming she had information about you, about some concern regarding the wedding preparations. I do not fully understand even now how the conversation shifted into whatever you witnessed, but I promise you, nothing improper had occurred before you walked in, and nothing continued after." Elena wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to accept an explanation that would somehow undo the pain of the past 5 years, but she had built her entire new life around the certainty of his betrayal, and accepting an alternative explanation now felt both liberating and terrifying in equal measure. "You married her," she said instead, deflecting from the vulnerability of her own uncertain feelings. "If nothing improper occurred, why did you marry Cassandra so soon after I left?" Adrian's expression grew pained. "Because I lost you," he said simply. "Because my family insisted the alliance needed to be preserved somehow, because I was exhausted from searching for you with no success, because I convinced myself that if you truly loved me, you would have given me the chance to explain, rather than simply vanishing without a word. I made a terrible mistake, Elena. I have known it every single day of my marriage to her." The rain continued falling outside as silence stretched between them, both processing the weight of 5 years of separation, misunderstanding, and pain. Elena found herself studying Adrian's face, searching for any sign of the deception she had believed defined his character for so long, but she saw only genuine regret and sorrow reflected in his expression. "I need time to think about all of this," she said finally. "This is not something I can process and respond to immediately, Adrian. You have just learned you have a son. I have spent 5 years believing you betrayed me completely. We cannot resolve 5 years of separation in a single conversation." Adrian nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression, despite the obvious difficulty of accepting her need for distance after finally finding her again. "I understand," he said. "But Elena, I cannot simply walk away now that I know Theo exists. I need to know my son. I need to be part of his life, regardless of whatever happens between us." The mention of Theo's needs cut through Elena's own emotional turmoil, forcing her to consider the situation from a perspective beyond her personal feelings toward Adrian. Theo deserved to know his father, deserved the opportunity for a relationship with him if Adrian was genuinely committed to being present in his life, rather than simply a temporary curiosity that would fade once the initial shock wore off. "I will not keep him from you," she said carefully. "But this needs to happen slowly, thoughtfully. Theo does not know anything about you. He believes his father died before he was born. Introducing this kind of change into his life needs to be handled with tremendous care." Adrian agreed readily, grateful for even this cautious opening toward a relationship with his son. "Whatever you think is best," he said. "I will follow your guidance on this. I only ask that you allow me the opportunity to know him, to be part of his life going forward." As they continued discussing the practical implications of this unexpected reunion, both were acutely aware of the larger complications lurking beneath the surface of their conversation. Adrian remained married to Cassandra, a marriage that had brought neither of them happiness, but which still existed as a legal and social reality that would need to be addressed before any deeper reconciliation between Elena and Adrian could be considered. "I need to return to the estate," Adrian said eventually, glancing toward the window where the rain had finally begun to ease. "I need to speak with my family, need to consider how to proceed given everything that has changed today. But I will return, Elena. I will not disappear from your lives now that I have found you." Elena watched him prepare to leave, feeling the complicated tangle of emotions that had defined this entire encounter. Hope, and fear, and old anger, and something that felt uncomfortably like the affection she had once felt for him, all competing for dominance within her heart. She did not know what the coming weeks would bring, did not know how to navigate the complicated reality of Adrian's continued marriage, while also allowing him access to his son, but she understood that the peaceful, simple life she had built in Millbrook had irrevocably changed the moment Adrian walked through her bakery's door. As Adrian's carriage finally departed, disappearing down the rain-slicked street, Elena remained standing at the window for a long while, processing everything that had transpired in the span of a single afternoon. Margaret eventually joined her, Theo now occupied with a book Edmund had lent him, and the older woman placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "What happens now?" Margaret asked quietly. Elena shook her head slowly, still staring out at the empty street where Adrian's carriage had disappeared from view. "I honestly do not know," she admitted, "but I suspect our peaceful life is about to become considerably more complicated." Adrian's return journey to the Blackwood estate felt endless, his mind consumed entirely by the events of that afternoon, by the image of his son's face, so clearly bearing traces of his own features, and by the overwhelming relief of finally finding Elena after 5 years of fruitless searching. He barely registered the passing countryside, his thoughts cycling repeatedly through possible approaches to the complicated situation now facing him. He arrived at the estate late in the evening, the household already settling into its nighttime routine, though light still burned in Cassandra's private sitting room, suggesting she remained awake. Adrian considered avoiding her entirely, retreating instead to his own chambers to process the day's revelations privately, but he recognized that any resolution to his current situation would eventually require confronting his wife directly about the marriage that had never truly functioned as intended. He found Cassandra reading by candlelight, her expression shifting to mild surprise as he entered without the customary announcement his valet usually provided. She set aside her book, studying his face with the particular attentiveness she reserved for moments when she sensed something significant had occurred. "You look troubled," she observed, her tone carrying the practiced neutrality that had come to characterize most of their interactions over the years. "Did your business trip not go as planned?" Adrian remained standing near the doorway, considering how best to approach the conversation he knew needed to happen. "I found Elena," he said finally, watching carefully for Cassandra's reaction. The color drained visibly from Cassandra's face, though she quickly composed herself, reaching for her book again, as if attempting to appear unconcerned by this news. "That is interesting," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. Where has she been hiding all these years? She has not been hiding, Adrian corrected. She has been building a life, raising our son. This revelation clearly struck Cassandra harder than the news of Elena's location alone had done. She set down her book entirely now, her expression shifting through several emotions before settling into something that looked remarkably like calculation, rather than genuine surprise. A son, she repeated slowly. And I suppose you intend to acknowledge this child, to bring further scandal upon our family? Adrian felt anger rising at her characterization of Theo as a source of scandal, rather than as his own flesh and blood, a child who deserved recognition and love, regardless of the circumstances surrounding his birth. He is my son, Cassandra, he said firmly. Of course I intend to acknowledge him, to be part of his life. I would think after everything that happened 5 years ago, you would understand why this matters so deeply to me. Cassandra's composure cracked slightly at this reference to the events that had originally driven Elena away. What exactly are you implying? She asked, though something in her tone suggested she understood precisely what he meant. I am asking you directly, Adrian said, moving closer to where she sat. What really happened that night in the study? Elena walked in on something, Cassandra. Something that ended my engagement and drove her away from everything she knew. I want the truth, finally, after 5 years of uncertainty. Cassandra stood abruptly, moving toward the window with her back to Adrian, and for a long moment she said nothing, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its earlier composure entirely. I loved you, she said quietly. I had loved you since we were children, watching Elena receive attention and affection that I believed should have been mine. When Father arranged your engagement to her rather than to me, something inside me simply could not accept it. Adrian felt a chill settle over him as he began to understand the full implications of her confession. What did you do, Cassandra? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I told her I needed to speak with you privately about wedding preparations, Cassandra continued, still refusing to face him directly. I knew she would come looking for you eventually. I positioned myself deliberately, created a scene that would appear compromising to anyone who witnessed it, knowing Elena's protective nature toward propriety would drive her away if she believed you had betrayed her trust. The confession, finally spoken aloud after 5 years of denial and deflection, hit Adrian with the force of confirmation he had suspected, but never definitively proven. You destroyed my life, he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. You destroyed Elena's life, forced her into hiding for 5 years, kept me from knowing my own son, all because of jealousy, over an arrangement that was never within my control to change. Cassandra finally turned to face him, tears now streaming down her face, though Adrian found himself unmoved by this display of emotion after learning the true extent of her deliberate manipulation. I am sorry, she said. I never intended for things to go this far, never expected her to simply vanish, rather than confronting either of us directly. Your intentions do not matter, Adrian replied coldly. Your actions have caused irreparable damage to multiple lives, Cassandra. I do not know how we proceed from here, but I know our marriage cannot continue as it has been. Not now that I know the truth about how it began. What are you saying? Cassandra asked, alarm evident in her voice despite her earlier confession. I am saying I intend to seek an annulment, Adrian said firmly. Given the circumstances of how this marriage began, given your deliberate deception, I believe there are grounds to pursue this legally. I will not continue living a lie built on your manipulation, especially not now that I have the chance to make things right with Elena and with our son. Cassandra's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions, disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked like desperate calculation. You cannot simply discard me, she said, her voice hardening. I am your wife, Adrian, regardless of how our marriage began. Society will not look kindly on such a public dissolution, especially not when the reasons involve your former fiancé's illegitimate child. Adrian felt his resolve strengthen at this threat, recognizing in her words the same manipulative tendencies that had originally destroyed his relationship with Elena. I do not care what society thinks, he said. I care about doing right by my son, and by the woman I should have married 5 years ago, if not for your deliberate interference. The conversation continued for hours that night, Cassandra alternating between pleading, threatening, and attempting to negotiate some compromise that would preserve her position as Duchess, but Adrian remained firm in his determination to pursue an annulment, understanding now that any continued relationship with Cassandra would only perpetuate the deception and manipulation that had defined their entire marriage from its very beginning. By the time dawn broke over the estate, exhausted from the emotionally draining confrontation, Adrian retreated to his own chambers, his mind already turning toward the practical steps necessary to dissolve his marriage and begin building a legitimate relationship with both Elena and Theo. He knew the path ahead would not be simple, that Cassandra would likely fight against the dissolution of their marriage with every resource available to her, and that society's judgment regarding the entire situation would prove harsh regardless of the eventual outcome. But for the first time in 5 years, Adrian felt something approaching genuine hope, the possibility of finally correcting the terrible mistake that had cost him everything he truly valued. He thought of Theo's face, so clearly bearing his own features, and of Elena's cautious but not entirely closed expression when she had agreed to allow him into their lives. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was determined to fight for the family that had been stolen from him through Cassandra's deliberate deception. As morning light filled his chambers, Adrian began drafting a letter to his family's solicitor, initiating the legal process that would eventually free him from a marriage built on manipulation and betrayal, while simultaneously composing in his mind the words he would use to explain everything to Elena when he returned to Millbrook, as he fully intended to do as soon as circumstances allowed. News of the confrontation between Adrian and Cassandra spread quickly through the estate's household staff, and within days, whispered rumors had begun circulating throughout the surrounding county, though the full details remained known only to those directly involved. Cassandra, recognizing that her position as Duchess had become increasingly precarious, retreated to her family's estate, ostensibly to visit relatives but in reality, seeking support and counsel regarding how to prevent the annulment Adrian had threatened to pursue. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, Elena found herself struggling to maintain her normal routine, despite the emotional upheaval Adrian's sudden reappearance had caused. She continued managing the bakery, continued caring for Theo with her usual attentiveness, but her mind repeatedly returned to their conversation, to the possibility that she had misjudged Adrian's role in the events that had originally driven her away. Margaret, sensing her friend's internal turmoil, encouraged her to consider carefully what she truly wanted going forward, rather than allowing either lingering anger or renewed hope to dictate her decisions without proper reflection. Elena appreciated this counsel, recognizing the wisdom in taking time to process everything before committing to any particular path regarding her complicated feelings toward Adrian. Theo, meanwhile, remained curious about the well-dressed stranger who had visited the bakery, asking Elena repeated questions about the man's identity and his apparent significance to their family. Elena found herself avoiding direct answers, uncertain how to explain such a complicated situation to a 5-year-old, though she recognized she could not delay this conversation indefinitely, especially if Adrian intended to remain involved in their lives going forward. A week after their initial reunion, a letter arrived at the bakery addressed to Elena, written in Adrian's careful handwriting. She retreated to her private chambers to read it alone, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the envelope and began absorbing its contents. Adrian's letter detailed the confrontation with Cassandra, laying out in careful detail her confession regarding the deliberate manipulation that had orchestrated the scene Elena witnessed 5 years earlier. He explained his intention to pursue an annulment, expressing his hope that once this legal matter was resolved, he might have the opportunity to properly court Elena again, to earn back the trust that Cassandra's deception had destroyed. Elena read the letter multiple times, processing the full weight of Cassandra's betrayal, not just of Adrian, but of Elena herself, her own sister deliberately orchestrating a situation designed to destroy her happiness, out of jealousy and resentment that had apparently simmered for years without Elena's knowledge. The revelation brought a complicated mixture of emotions, vindication that her instincts about Adrian's character had perhaps been correct, combined with fresh grief regarding her sister's willingness to cause such profound harm. She shared the letter's contents with Margaret that evening, watching the older woman's expression shift through disbelief and anger as she absorbed the full extent of Cassandra's manipulation. "Your sister orchestrated your entire departure from that life," Margaret said, her voice heavy with the implications of such a betrayal. "She stole 5 years from you, from Adrian, from Theo's opportunity to know his father. Elena nodded slowly, still processing the weight of this revelation herself. I do not know how to feel, she admitted. Part of me wants to be angry at Adrian still, for not fighting harder to understand what happened, for marrying her so quickly afterward. But another part of me recognizes that he was also a victim of her deception, manipulated just as thoroughly as I was. Over the following weeks, Adrian continued writing to Elena regularly, sharing updates on the progress of his legal proceedings, while also asking careful questions about Theo, expressing genuine interest in his son's interests, his personality, his daily routines. Elena found herself gradually softening toward these communications, recognizing in Adrian's persistent but respectful correspondence a genuine commitment to building a relationship with his son, regardless of whatever romantic possibilities might or might not develop between himself and Elena. She began sharing small details about Theo in her responses, mentioning his love of stories, his natural curiosity about the world, his particular fondness for a wooden horse Beatrice had given him for his birthday. These exchanges gradually built a foundation of communication between Elena and Adrian that felt entirely different from the relationship they had shared 5 years earlier, more measured and thoughtful, built on honesty rather than the naive optimism of young love. Adrian's legal proceedings progressed slower than he had hoped, Cassandra's family employing considerable resources to delay and complicate the annulment process, hoping perhaps that time would soften Adrian's resolve, or that some alternative resolution might present itself. But Adrian remained steadfast in his determination, providing his solicitors with detailed accounts of Cassandra's confession, along with corroborating testimony from household staff who had witnessed suspicious behavior on the night in question, 5 years earlier. 2 months after their initial reunion, Adrian returned to Millbrook, this time with advance notice provided through his correspondence with Elena, allowing her the opportunity to prepare Theo for meeting the stranger who had visited the bakery previously. She had decided, after much deliberation and discussion with Margaret, that Theo deserved to know at least a simplified version of the truth, that this visitor was actually his father, someone who wanted very much to be part of his life going forward. Theo's reaction to this news proved more complicated than Elena had anticipated, a mixture of excitement at the prospect of having a father and confusion regarding why this information had been kept from him for his entire life thus far. Elena did her best to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms, emphasizing that circumstances beyond anyone's immediate control had kept them apart, but that his father wanted very much to know him now and build a relationship going forward. When Adrian's carriage arrived at the bakery on the appointed day, Theo watched from the window with a mixture of nervous anticipation that mirrored his mother's own complicated feelings about this reunion. Adrian emerged from the carriage, his expression betraying similar nervousness as he approached the bakery's entrance, clearly uncertain how this crucial first proper meeting with his son would unfold. Elena had prepared a private space in the small garden behind the bakery, wanting to give Adrian and Theo the opportunity to become acquainted, without the distraction of customers or curious onlookers. She made brief introductions, watching carefully as Adrian knelt to bring himself to Theo's eye level, his expression softening with obvious emotion as he studied his son's face properly for the first time. "Hello, Theo," he said gently. "My name is Adrian. Your mother tells me you enjoy stories very much." Theo studied him with the particular directness children often possessed, apparently satisfied by what he observed in Adrian's expression and manner. "Mother says you're my father," he said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory, though clearly he had been processing this information carefully in the days since Elena's explanation. "I am," Adrian confirmed, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. "I did not know about you until recently, Theo, or I would have come to find you and your mother much sooner. I am very glad to finally meet you." The conversation that followed, tentative and careful at first, gradually relaxed into something approaching genuine connection, as Adrian asked Theo about his interests, listened attentively to his enthusiastic descriptions of favorite stories and games, and shared some of his own childhood memories in return. Elena watched from a slight distance, her heart aching with a complicated mixture of emotions, as she observed her son and his father building the beginning of what she hoped would become a genuine, lasting relationship. As the afternoon progressed, Theo's initial reserve melted away entirely, replaced by the easy enthusiasm he typically displayed toward new friends, and by the time Adrian needed to depart to attend to other business matters in the region, Theo had extracted a promise that he would return soon, along with commitments regarding specific stories Adrian had promised to share during his next visit. After Adrian's departure, Elena found Theo unusually thoughtful, processing the significance of this new relationship in his young mind. "He's nice," he said finally, looking up at Elena with an expression that mixed curiosity with something like hope. "Will he come back again?" Elena knelt to embrace her son, feeling tears prick at her eyes, despite her efforts to remain composed for his benefit. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe he will, Theo. I believe your father intends to be very much part of your life going forward." As she held her son close, Elena allowed herself to feel, for the first time in years, genuine hope regarding the possibility of a future that included Adrian. Not just as Theo's father, but perhaps eventually as something more. Though she recognized that considerable work remained before such possibilities could be fully realized, including the resolution of Adrian's complicated legal situation with Cassandra, and the rebuilding of trust between herself and the man she had once loved so completely. As months passed following that first proper meeting between Adrian and Theo, a comfortable pattern emerged. Adrian visiting Millbrook regularly, his relationship with Theo deepening with each encounter, while his correspondence with Elena continued to build a foundation of renewed trust and understanding between them. The legal proceedings regarding his marriage to Cassandra dragged on, complicated by her family's continued resistance and various procedural delays that tested Adrian's patience considerably. Cassandra, for her part, had shifted her approach from outright denial to a more calculated strategy, spreading carefully worded rumors throughout society that painted herself as a wronged wife, victim of her husband's obsession with a former fiancé, and an illegitimate child that threatened to bring scandal upon the Blackwood name. These rumors created considerable difficulty for Adrian, complicating his business relationships and social standing throughout the county. Elena remained largely insulated from these societal complications, protected by the distance between Millbrook and the circles where such gossip typically circulated. But occasional whispers still reached her through Adrian's careful updates, and she found herself increasingly concerned about the toll this ongoing conflict was taking on him, despite her own lingering hesitation about fully trusting the possibility of reconciliation. During one particular visit, Adrian arrived, looking more exhausted than usual, dark circles evident beneath his eyes, and a weariness in his posture that concerned Elena, despite her efforts to maintain emotional distance regarding matters beyond Theo's relationship with his father. She found herself asking about his well-being with genuine concern, surprising herself with the depth of care she still apparently felt for him despite everything that had transpired between them. "The legal battle grows more complicated by the week," Adrian admitted, settling into a chair in Elena's small sitting room while Theo napped upstairs, having worn himself out during an energetic afternoon of games with his father. "Cassandra's family has produced witnesses willing to testify that our marriage was entirely legitimate, that her account of manipulating that evening 5 years ago was simply an emotional outburst not reflective of actual events." Elena felt anger rising at this news, recognizing the desperate lengths Cassandra's family was apparently willing to go to preserve their daughter's position and reputation, regardless of the truth or the harm such deception continued to cause. "Can they actually prevent the annulment through such tactics?" she asked. Adrian shook his head wearily. "My solicitors believe the evidence ultimately favors my position, particularly given Cassandra's original confession, which was witnessed by several household staff members who have provided consistent testimony. But the process continues to drag on, and I confess the constant fighting has begun to wear on me considerably." Elena found herself moving to sit beside him, offering comfort in the form of quiet companionship, rather than empty reassurances about a situation whose outcome remained genuinely uncertain. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, and Elena realized this was perhaps the first moment since Adrian's return into her life where she had allowed herself to simply be present with him, without the protective walls she had maintained throughout their previous interactions. "I believe you," she said finally, breaking the silence. "About what happened that night, about Cassandra's manipulation. I have believed you for some time now, Adrian, though I have perhaps been reluctant to fully acknowledge this to you directly." Adrian turned to look at her, hope evident in his expression, despite the exhaustion that had characterized his demeanor throughout the visit. "That means more to me than I can properly express," he said quietly. "I know I cannot undo the 5 years we lost, cannot erase the pain my marriage to Cassandra caused you, even indirectly. But I hope, eventually, we might find our way back to something resembling what we once shared." Elena felt her own cautious hope stirring in response to his words, though she recognized the wisdom in proceeding carefully, rather than rushing back into a relationship built on old feelings, without properly addressing the complicated circumstances that continued to surround them. "We should wait," she said gently, "until your legal situation with Cassandra is fully resolved. It would not be appropriate, nor wise, to consider anything beyond friendship while you remain legally married to her, regardless of how estranged that marriage has become." Adrian nodded, accepting her reasoning, despite the evident disappointment in his expression. "You are right, of course," he acknowledged. "I do not wish to complicate your life, or Theo's, with additional uncertainty. I will focus on resolving this legal matter as quickly as possible, and we can consider our own future once that resolution has been achieved." As if summoned by this decision to exercise patience, the legal proceedings finally began progressing more favorably in the following weeks. A key piece of evidence emerged when one of the household staff members who had witnessed Cassandra's original confession came forward with a detailed written account, provided under oath, that corroborated everything Adrian had reported regarding his wife's admission of deliberate manipulation. This testimony, combined with the previous evidence Adrian's solicitors had already compiled, proved sufficient to overcome the delays Cassandra's family had orchestrated. The court presiding over the annulment proceedings found compelling evidence that the marriage had been entered into under circumstances involving deliberate deception, providing legitimate grounds for the dissolution Adrian had sought for months. The formal annulment was granted on a gray autumn morning, and Adrian traveled immediately to Millbrook to share this news with Elena, arriving at the bakery with an expression that combined relief with a cautious joy he had not allowed himself to fully express throughout the lengthy legal battle. Elena, upon hearing the news, felt a corresponding wave of relief wash over her, recognizing that this resolution finally cleared the path toward whatever future she and Adrian might choose to build together. "It is finished," Adrian said, taking both her hands in his own as they stood together in the bakery's small garden, the same space where he had first properly met his son months earlier. "I am free now, Elena. Free to properly pursue what I should have fought for 5 years ago, if I had known then what I know now about Cassandra's deception." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, the accumulated weight of 5 years of pain and uncertainty finally beginning to lift. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer he intended to provide. "Now," Adrian said, his expression growing serious despite the joy evident beneath his words, "I would like the opportunity to properly court you, Elena, to earn back your trust and affection the right way, without the shadow of Cassandra's manipulation hanging over us. I know this will require patience and time, and I am prepared to offer both, for as long as necessary." Elena felt the last of her carefully maintained defenses beginning to crumble in the face of Adrian's genuine sincerity and the evident depth of his commitment to rebuilding what they had lost. "I would like that," she said softly, watching relief and joy transform his expression completely. "I would like that very much, Adrian." As they stood together in the garden, the autumn sun breaking briefly through clouds that had threatened rain throughout the morning, both Elena and Adrian allowed themselves to hope, cautiously but genuinely, for a future that had seemed impossible just months earlier. There remained challenges ahead, the practical matters of blending their separate lives, the social complications that would inevitably arise from acknowledging Theo publicly, and the simple but significant work of rebuilding trust and intimacy after years of separation and pain. But for the first time since that terrible night in the study 5 years earlier, both Elena and Adrian felt genuinely optimistic about what lay ahead, no longer burdened by uncertainty or deception, but instead building toward a future founded on honesty, patience, and the rediscovered love that had somehow survived, despite every obstacle placed in its path. With the annulment finalized, and Adrian officially free from his obligations to Cassandra, he began the careful process of courting Elena properly, visiting Millbrook with increasing frequency, bringing small, thoughtful gifts for both Elena and Theo, and gradually rebuilding the emotional intimacy that had once defined their relationship before circumstances had torn them apart so completely. These months of renewed courtship differed considerably from their original relationship years earlier, marked now by a deeper appreciation for what they had lost and a more mature understanding of the work required to build lasting trust. Adrian made a point of never pressuring Elena toward decisions she was not ready to make, allowing her to set the pace for their evolving relationship, while consistently demonstrating through his actions that his commitment to both her and Theo remained unwavering. Theo, meanwhile, flourished in his growing relationship with his father, eagerly anticipating each of Adrian's visits, and gradually beginning to understand, in age-appropriate terms, the complicated circumstances that had kept them apart for the early years of his life. Adrian made sure to explain, without placing blame or burden on his young son's understanding, that adults sometimes made mistakes, and that circumstances beyond anyone's immediate control had delayed their reunion, but that nothing would separate them again. The community of Millbrook, initially curious about the well-dressed gentleman making regular visits to their beloved bakery owner, gradually came to understand the basic outline of Elena's true history, information she chose to share carefully with trusted friends, like Margaret and Rosalind, who had proven their loyalty and discretion over the years. Rather than judgment, Elena found only continued support from those who had come to know and respect her character over the years she had spent building her life in their community. As winter approached and the relationship between Elena and Adrian continued deepening, Adrian began raising the topic of Theo's future more directly, gently broaching the subject of formally acknowledging his son as heir to the Blackwood title and estate. This conversation required considerable care, as it touched upon complicated questions regarding Theo's upbringing, his eventual transition into a world of noble responsibilities, entirely different from the simple, community-focused life he had known in Millbrook. Elena harbored genuine concerns about this transition, worried about uprooting Theo from everything familiar, from his friendships with Beatrice and other local children, from the bakery that had become such an integral part of his identity, and from the community that had embraced them both so completely during their years in Millbrook. These concerns, she recognized, needed to be balanced against Theo's eventual right to know and claim his heritage, along with the opportunities and responsibilities that came with his position as Adrian's legitimate heir. "We do not need to rush this decision," Adrian assured her during one particular conversation, recognizing her hesitation and wanting to provide reassurance rather than pressure. "Theo can continue growing up here in Millbrook for now, with regular visits to the estate to help him gradually become familiar with that part of his heritage as well. There is no need to force an immediate, complete transition that might overwhelm him or disrupt the stability he has known throughout his childhood." This measured approach provided Elena with the reassurance she needed to feel more comfortable considering Theo's eventual acknowledgement as Adrian's heir, understanding that this process could unfold gradually, rather than requiring an abrupt, disorienting change to her son's entire way of life. Over the following months, Theo began accompanying Adrian on occasional visits to the Blackwood estate, gradually becoming acquainted with the grand house and gardens that would eventually become central to his adult life and responsibilities. Adrian's mother, upon learning of her grandson's existence, welcomed Theo with open arms and evident joy, delighted to finally have a grandchild after years of a marriage that had produced no children and had ultimately proven so troubled and unhappy. She quickly became a beloved figure in Theo's expanding world, sharing stories of the estate's history and gradually helping him understand the family legacy he would eventually inherit. As spring returned once more to Millbrook, marking a full year since Adrian's unexpected reappearance in Elena's bakery, their relationship had grown into something both recognized as more solid and mature than what they had shared as young lovers years earlier. Adrian proposed during a quiet evening in the same garden where he had first properly met his son, presenting Elena with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, rather than the original engagement ring that carried painful associations with their previous, ill-fated engagement. Elena accepted without hesitation, tears of genuine joy replacing the pain and uncertainty that had characterized so much of the previous years since their initial parting. Theo, upon learning of the engagement, expressed his enthusiastic approval, having grown genuinely fond of Adrian and excited by the prospect of their family becoming officially unified. Their wedding, planned for early summer, differed considerably from the grand affair that had originally been planned years earlier for Elena's first engagement. This time, the ceremony would be smaller, more intimate, held in Millbrook itself, rather than at the Blackwood estate, honoring the community that had provided Elena and Theo with shelter, support, and genuine belonging during their years of separation from Adrian's world. Margaret, of course, would play a central role in the ceremony, having become far more than simply an employer or landlady over the years, but rather a genuine family member whose kindness had made everything that followed possible. Rosalind's assistance with wedding preparations, along with the enthusiastic participation of the broader Millbrook community, transformed what could have been a stressful undertaking into a joyful celebration anticipated by the entire town. As preparations continued, Adrian also began the formal legal process of acknowledging Theo as his legitimate heir, a process considerably simplified by the annulment of his previous marriage and the absence of any competing claims to the Blackwood title. Cassandra, following the dissolution of their marriage, had retreated entirely from public life, her family's reputation having suffered considerably from the scandal surrounding her deliberate manipulation years earlier. Though Adrian made a point of ensuring the legal proceedings avoided unnecessary cruelty toward her, recognizing that continued conflict would serve no productive purpose for anyone involved, particularly not for Theo's emotional well-being. The formal acknowledgement ceremony, held at the Blackwood estate with representatives from throughout the county in attendance, marked Theo's official recognition as Adrian's heir, a significant milestone that Elena watched with a complicated mixture of pride and lingering anxiety regarding the responsibilities her son would eventually assume. Theo, dressed in formal attire that felt considerably different from his usual comfortable clothing, nonetheless carried himself with a natural confidence that suggested he would adapt well to his eventual role, regardless of the challenges such a transition might present. Following the ceremony, as guests mingled throughout the estate's grand gardens, Elena found herself standing beside Adrian, watching their son interact easily with various dignitaries and family friends, his natural charm and intelligence evident even in this unfamiliar formal setting. She felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her, recognizing how far they had all traveled from that painful night 5 years earlier, when her entire world had seemed to collapse around her. "We have come a long way," Adrian said quietly, seeming to sense her reflective mood as he moved closer to stand beside her. "We have," Elena agreed, allowing herself to lean slightly against him, drawing comfort from his steady presence beside her. "I never imagined we would find our way back to each other, especially not with our son alongside us throughout this journey." Adrian wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, and together they continued watching Theo navigate the gathering with his characteristic ease and curiosity, both parents feeling the particular satisfaction that came from watching their child thrive despite the complicated circumstances of his early years. Whatever challenges remained ahead, whatever adjustments Theo would need to make as he transitioned more fully into his role as future Duke, Elena felt confident that the foundation of love, honesty, and community support they had built would carry him successfully through whatever the future might hold. The morning of Elena and Adrian's wedding dawned clear and bright, sunlight filling Millbrook's town square where the entire community had gathered to celebrate the union of the bakery owner they had come to love and the Duke, who had finally found his way back to her after years of painful separation. Flowers decorated every available surface, contributed generously by nearly every household in town, transforming the modest square into a scene of genuine celebration and communal joy. Elena stood in Margaret's small back room, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that reflected her preference for understated beauty over ostentatious display, a choice that felt entirely appropriate given how far she had traveled from the world of grand noble weddings she had once expected to inhabit. Margaret helped arrange her hair with careful, practiced hands, both women reflecting quietly on the journey that had brought them to this joyful moment. "I never imagined, all those years ago when you arrived at my door soaked from travel and heartbreak," Margaret said softly, "that we would eventually arrive at such a happy occasion. You have become like a daughter to me, Elena, and watching you find your way to genuine happiness brings me more joy than I can properly express." Elena embraced her dear friend, tears threatening to disrupt the careful makeup Rosalind had helped apply earlier that morning. "I could never have survived these years, could never have built the life Theo and I now enjoy, without your kindness and support," she said. "You gave us a home when we had nowhere else to turn, and I will be forever grateful for everything you have done for us." Outside, Theo waited with Adrian near the town square's small chapel, dressed in formal but comfortable attire that Elena had insisted upon, wanting her son to feel like himself, rather than uncomfortably constrained by excessive formality on such an important day. Adrian knelt beside him, straightening his son's collar with careful attention, both clearly anticipating the ceremony that would formally unite their small family. "You look very handsome," Adrian told him, pride evident in his voice as he studied his son's eager expression. Theo beamed at this compliment, then asked with characteristic directness, "Will you and Mother be happy now? Forever?" Adrian felt his heart swell with emotion at this simple but profound question, recognizing in it both his son's genuine concern for his parents' happiness and the underlying hope that the family instability of recent years might finally reach a permanent, positive resolution. "I certainly hope so," he said honestly. "I intend to spend every day making sure your mother knows how much I love her, and how grateful I am that we found our way back to each other, and to you." As the appointed hour arrived, guests settled into their places throughout the town square, a diverse gathering that included Millbrook's ordinary townspeople, alongside various nobility from Adrian's world, all brought together by this unusual but joyful occasion. Edmund from the bookshop sat near the front, having become something of an honorary grandfather to Theo over the years, while Adrian's own mother occupied a place of honor, delighted finally to witness her son's genuine happiness after years of watching him suffer through a loveless, troubled marriage. The ceremony itself proceeded with simple elegance, the local minister, who had come to know Elena well during her years in Millbrook, officiating, with evident warmth and genuine happiness for the couple standing before him. When Elena finally appeared, walking down the flower-strewn path toward where Adrian waited, the entire gathering seemed to hold its collective breath, witnessing the culmination of a love story that had survived betrayal, separation, and years of uncertainty, to finally reach this joyful resolution. Adrian's expression, as he watched Elena approach, radiated a happiness and relief that moved many observers to tears, the visible manifestation of 5 years of longing and searching, finally reaching its conclusion. When Elena reached his side, taking his offered hand, both felt the profound weight and joy of this moment, understanding fully how precious and hard won their reunion truly was. The vows they exchanged reflected this deeper understanding, moving beyond simple romantic promises to acknowledge explicitly the challenges they had overcome and the commitment they now made to honesty, patience, and unwavering support for each other going forward. Adrian spoke of his gratitude for Elena's strength and resilience during their years apart, for the remarkable job she had done raising their son despite facing such circumstances entirely alone. Elena, in turn, spoke of her own journey toward forgiveness and renewed trust, acknowledging that true love required not just passion, but also patience, honesty, and the willingness to rebuild what circumstances and deception had once torn apart. As they exchanged rings and were finally pronounced husband and wife, the gathered crowd erupted in genuine, joyful celebration, Theo running forward to embrace both his parents as they shared their first kiss as a legally united family. The celebration that followed continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening, filling Millbrook's town square with music, dancing, and abundant food, prepared by Margaret and her assistants, working alongside contributions from nearly every household in the grateful community. Elena moved through the celebration with genuine joy, dancing with Adrian, with Theo, and with the many friends who had supported her throughout her years in Millbrook. As evening settled over the celebration, Adrian found a quiet moment to pull Elena aside, away from the joyful chaos of the reception, wanting to share something he had been planning for weeks. "I have been thinking," he said, "about our future, about where we should make our home going forward." Elena felt a flicker of concern, wondering if he intended to insist upon an immediate, complete relocation to the Blackwood estate, despite her earlier concerns about disrupting Theo's stable, familiar life in Millbrook. But Adrian continued, before she could voice these worries, "I believe we should maintain our presence here in Millbrook, at least for the coming years," he said, watching relief flood across her expression. "I have already begun arrangements to purchase a suitable property nearby, one that would allow us to remain close to this community that has meant so much to both you and Theo, while also providing appropriate space for visits to and from the estate, as Theo gradually becomes more familiar with his eventual responsibilities." Elena felt overwhelming gratitude at this thoughtful compromise, recognizing in Adrian's proposal a genuine understanding of what mattered most to her and to their son's continued happiness and stability. "Thank you," she said softly, embracing him warmly. "This means more to me than you know." "We are a family now," Adrian said simply, holding her close. "Whatever decisions we make going forward, we will make them together, considering what serves all of our happiness and well-being, not simply tradition or expectation." As the celebration continued around them, and as Theo eventually fell asleep in Margaret's arms, exhausted from the excitement of the day, Elena reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment of genuine happiness and security. The pain of that terrible night 5 years earlier, the loneliness and uncertainty of her early days in Millbrook, the fear and determination that had characterized her years raising Theo alone, all of it had led ultimately to this celebration, to this reunion with the man she had always truly loved, and to the secure, happy future now stretching before their small but resilient family. The following years would bring their own challenges, the gradual process of Theo's transition into his eventual role as future Duke, the ongoing work of building trust and intimacy within their marriage, and the practical complications of maintaining connections to both Millbrook and the Blackwood estate. But as Elena watched her sleeping son and felt Adrian's steady presence beside her, she understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as the loving, united family they had always been meant to become, despite every obstacle that had once threatened to keep them permanently apart. Their story, born from betrayal and separation, had ultimately transformed into one of resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring power of genuine love to overcome even the most painful circumstances, proving that sometimes the family we are meant to have finds its way to us, even after the longest and most difficult of journeys.